Yes, that's right.
Hello. Right, we're live.
Also got something coming up.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's panel session. I'm Callum Newton. I'm one of the senior researchers in Onward's Levelling Up programme. And today we're going to be discussing planning reform. So, as many of you will be aware, Britain is in the midst of an unprecedented housing crisis at the moment, and ultimately supply is struggling to keep up with demand. And Britain's cities are bearing the brunt of rising levels of unaffordability across the UK. And the UK's planning system is considered one of the major barriers to meeting demand. And today we have the perfect panel of experts to discuss ways around this. So, in terms of introductions, to my right, we have the Minister for Housing and Planning, Rachel Maclean. We also have Landsec CEO and sponsor of today's event, Allan. To my left, we have Growth and Programme Director at the London School of Economics, Dr. Valero. And on the end, we have Senior Analyst at the Centre for Cities, Anthony Breach. So the way it's going to work this afternoon is I'm going to invite all of the panelists to give a brief introductory remarks, and then I'll open it up to the floor to discuss questions. I'd like to invite everyone to join the discussion online, specifically on Twitter using the hashtag CPC23. We'll also be streaming today's session live on our YouTube channel as well. So with that in mind, I'd like to invite the Minister to give her introductory remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Callum, and it's lovely to see everybody here today. I feel particularly privileged to be here today because I'm talking about my favourite topic, and it's also my birthday. So what better way is there to spend a birthday than with an Onward mug of tea and a wonderful event. So this is a really serious subject, and I've been talking at a number of panels on this fringe, and I can see lots of familiar faces and familiar questions that will no doubt be posed to me. We are absolutely focused on our overall mission of levelling up the country, and housing is playing a key part in that. It has to, because it's vital national infrastructure. And we need to make sure we get the houses built across the country that we need. We need to get those houses in the right places so that people can actually afford to buy or rent or actually get a home of their own that's affordable. There are clearly enormous challenges across the system, and no doubt we will get to them. We are taking a holistic view of this, which is why Michael Gove set out his long-term plan for housing, which he set out a couple of months ago in King's Cross, which is a superb example of urban regeneration and renaissance led by Peter Freeman, obviously, who now heads up Homes England and helps us to do that across the country using public money. The elements of our vision for the long-term plan for housing are that you cannot take any single element and suggest this is a solution in isolation. If you just pump money into the demand side, you're going to see inflation, you're going to see all sorts of distortions across the system. If you just address the supply side without also thinking about demand, then you'll have supply, but you won't actually have anybody who can afford to buy the houses or develop them in the first place. So we have to think about them together, working in tandem, and it necessitates a long-term view. The key elements of the long-term plan for housing recognise that where the affordability crisis is the most acute is, first and foremost, in London, which is why it is right that we look at the capacity of London to deliver more. We clearly have seen a failure of London to deliver the houses that are needed, especially compared to the scale of the affordability element in London. It is quite extraordinary to see the mismatch between salaries and earnings in London and the ability of young people, in particular first-time buyers, to buy or rent a home. It is therefore right that we take those long-term decisions now, that the Secretary of State uses the powers that he has, those legal powers, if necessary, to intervene to make sure that that London plan delivers a lot more housing. We then talk about Cambridge, which is the other key area that the long-term plan for housing talked about. Cambridge is clearly a national asset. It is essential to the economic growth of the whole of the United Kingdom. It is in our national interest to develop Cambridge and its biomedical, its tech, its life sciences hub, because that is going to spread prosperity around the country. But what is holding it back now? It is the lack of space, it is the lack of ability for housing and laboratories to be built. So that's why we are working again together with our partners, Homes England and others, to bring about this vision where we can see Cambridge expanding. And let's be clear, not everybody will be happy with that. There will be people who object to it. We are sticking to our vision of this being an urban quarter with beautiful design at the heart of it, with placemaking as its central vision. Yes, using brownfield, but also maybe using greenfield in some areas, because you simply cannot expand Cambridge without in some way using greenfield. Yes, we have to do it with community consent, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. But it is a strategic decision for this government to intervene in a place like Cambridge, and I therefore think it is the right thing to do. So I know that we have people on the panel who are experts in brownfield development and urban regeneration. It's right that we work with them. It is also right that we put public money behind some of the brownfield infrastructure and land projects that we have done, and that we continue to do that. And those are really exciting. They're really important in terms of the regeneration agenda. I've seen it coming to light in places like Birmingham, Digbeth, and many other places, Leeds, Bradford, and parts of London, just to mention a few. There's huge potential there, but we are kidding ourselves if we think we can meet the housing need of the nation just on brownfield land. We have to go much further than that. And before anyone asks me, can I just say very clearly, no, we have not dropped housing targets. We still have them. We must have them. It is an urgent need for us to build the houses that we need across the country, and we will continue to make sure we do that.
Thank you, Minister. Some excellent points there, and stay tuned for Onward research on many of them in the months ahead. So I'd like to move on to Mark, please.
Yeah, firstly, thank you very much, and happy birthday.
Thank you.
Minister. So I wasn't expecting to say that today. Let me first of all just say a couple of remarks about Landsec and why this is such an important topic for us as a business. Now, I mean, Landsec's a FTSE 100 business. We are the largest of the listed property businesses in the UK, focused purely on the UK. But fundamentally, we are a cities business. About half of our portfolio, we have about £12 billion invested in property across the UK. About half of that is in London, but an increasingly large amount of that is being invested in cities outside of London. And why we feel planning is such an important, planning reform is such an important thing for us to tackle, is it feels in many ways that at times there is a virtual obsession with planning being about building houses on greenfield, and that stymies a debate of what else planning can unlock. And as a result of that, I think it misses the very significant opportunity to accelerate investment through a more targeted approach to how we unlock and reform our planning system. And let me just put some Landsec numbers to that. And this is what one company talking. We invest each year, depending on the year, between £500 million and £1 billion into cities, into major mixed-use, dense, complex urban developments. We could and would invest double that. And we have partners and investors that would invest alongside us to make that a reality. You're absolutely right, the demand and supply side of things needs to be taken into account. But the reason we're confident in that is, as a business, we have increasingly moved from what was initially a business focused on primarily office development and shopping centre development to a business that is now very much focused on mixed-use places that meet the needs, or aspire to meet the needs, of the changing needs of society and of cities. And so to be able to double investment and as part of that mixed use bring forward housing is something that, to me, what that needs is, rather than focusing purely on greenfields and can or can't we build, or shouldn't we build housing, is to actually turn that around and say instead, what do we need to do to accelerate brownfield development? Now, we have a mile from here, adjacent to Piccadilly Station in Manchester, a fabulous brownfield regeneration mixed-use project. It'll be residential, it'll be offices, retail, leisure, and that is on a site that lay derelict for decades. Now, I don't know the precise numbers, But I know that when we brought that project forward, it was not a wave of objections from people. We had communities, politicians, and ourselves eager to bring that project forward. And so we have developed, in conjunction with our contemporaries at British Land, also with Berkeley Group, others within the sector, a series of targeted proposals that's not about changing or introducing primary legislation. It's about what can we do now? What can we do in this government? Indeed, what can we do in the first 100 days of the next government? But we think it needs a focus on brownfield and not an obsession purely with greenfield. And one final thing I'll say before handing back to you is that to try and get a sense of this, we've undertaken, commissioned some research to look at the extent of housing need, as well as simply the investment numbers that could be met on brownfield sites. And we've looked at 16 locations across the UK. We've looked at the Brownfield Land Register. We've looked at housing need, and we've made some sensible assumptions on the level of densities that could be delivered on those brownfield sites. And there are places such as the West Midlands with that very high level, admittedly, analysis that would suggest actually 90% of housing need can be met on brownfield sites. In London, with the scale of housing need, to your points, Minister, it's lower, it's 40 to 50%, but it is very, very significant. So we believe, whilst it can't answer everything, it can and will deliver more growth, more homes and more jobs.
Excellent, thank you, Mark. Okay, I'd like to move on to Dr. Anna. Next. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be here. Happy birthday also from me.
Thank you.
So I'm going to draw on some perspectives from the Economy 2030 inquiry, which I'm working on. It's a big collaboration between Resolution Foundation and the Centre for Economic Performance at the LSE, and also the UK Urban Futures Commission, which you might have seen as something launched by the RSA in the core cities last week. And both of these large bodies of work are arguing that there's no plausible route to prosperity for the UK without improving investment and growth and productivity in our cities. And as you'll know, we face this long-standing growth problem where really productivity performance is at its heart. So, cities are where most people live and work. The kind of analysis we've been doing is that some of our big cities need many more people living and working in them, and they need to focus on some of the things that they really have comparative strengths on, such as services, tradable service sectors, which benefit from agglomeration economies.
Yep.
So some of the work that we did in one of our reports for the Economy 2030 inquiry was looking at business investment. So underlying our poor productivity performance in the UK is weak business investment. We looked very broadly at what are the things that are holding back business investment in the UK. In fact, there are many strengths in the UK. It's not that there aren't profitable projects. We saw in the last session here about all the excellence in our innovation system, for example. But one of the areas that we really focused on for this piece of work was planning. So that brings me to why we're here today. So planning reform being a key way to unleash an urban renaissance, as is in the title. It's clear that our planning system holds back investment in the UK and in particular places that have growth potential. And it's widely agreed in policy reports, commissions, academic papers that construction is made more costly in the UK because of the stringency and unpredictability in our planning system. And when we looked at regulation more broadly, the UK does well on regulation. We're generally quite an we have good regulatory environment, but it's the planning regulation that is particularly restrictive in the UK. So it's a development control system, which means that it's discretionary. Decisions are made on a case-by-case basis. While there might be local plans in place, developments can be refused even when they're meeting the requirements of those plans. In fact, 6 out of every 10 local authorities in England don't have an up-to-date plan, or they didn't in 2022. And another problem is that the level that plans are made are often too disaggregated. So if we're thinking about economic development, the gains are felt across a wider economic area than the local area that has a plan or where decisions on developments are made. So those local places might face political costs from having development, but not necessarily feel the broader economic benefits. So why is this planning system then holding back investment? I said, there's the costs, obviously, but there's this direct effect, and it was mentioned before, planning restrictions might hold back the lab space from being developed in a place where there's a clear need from businesses to have lab space or to have office space. It might also introduce a higher cost of capital and uncertainty. But then there's the indirect effect, which then is where I would put housing. If we don't have the housing in the places where businesses need their workers to be, there's going to be poorer matching of workers to businesses, less ability to match worker demand and supply, not have those agglomeration economies that we want. And this is generally bad for economic dynamism, which is something that's actually been in decline in the UK. So I've said that the planning system is restrictive. The outcome of this is you can actually see quite a stark statistic that we had in our report, which is the UK has actually not seen any increase in the amount of built-up land per capita since 1990. And if anything, there's been a fall this century. This is in stark contrast to every other G7 economy. And you might say, well, maybe we're just very dense, or maybe we're protecting our natural environment better. But actually, other similarly dense countries have increased that measure, and other countries with higher share of land protected, say for forestry, etc., have done better on that measure. So what are the recommendations that we kind of made? And some of these are very much out there. Some of them were in the 2020 white paper on planning. But one of them was simply that development plans must exist and they should be adhered to, providing certainty that compliant developments in local places will proceed. This also involves making local plans simpler, more proactive, more binding. So it's basically having kind of zone-based approaches where you have designated growth areas, a shift of community engagement rather than just being at the ex-post stage where there's a project, does the community agree with it? It's more participatory decision-making in that plan phase. Second, plans and decision-making relating to commercial and business development should be carried out at the right level. That's where particularly the point I made about the economic area, which might be a travel to work area level, it might be a combined authority, which kind of makes natural sense. And then finally, a kind of broader point is that local authorities should have more meaningful financial incentives for development, both commercial and residential. That ties into the kind of fiscal devolution debate. But even within the current system, there are other ways that local communities can feel more of the economic benefits from development. There are, of course, significant political constraints to this kind of planning reform, and we've seen that. And, of course, there are many things that I think can be done within current structures, and particularly if national progress remains difficult, then certain structures, whether it's development corporations, whether it's working with combined authorities, there are many things that could probably be improved along many of these dimensions in the current setup. And part of trying to enable that national level coordination in terms of what are our growth priorities as a country and how do they cascade to different places, there is an argument for having stronger institutions governing growth policy in general in the UK. This is an area where we haven't necessarily had very strong institutions. There's been a lot of change in policy, but where such big barriers seem to exist, it would be a way of coordinating and trying to address those barriers. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Anna. Some interesting points there, which I'm sure we'll come back to in the discussion. And finally, I'd like to move on to Ant.
Thank you, Callum, and thank you everyone for coming here today, and happy birthday, Minister.
Thank you.
So, planning reform is going to happen, right? So I've been going around conference today, going to all the housing fringes, all the planning fringes, and chatting to people there, listening to the panelists, having conversations, and people are saying some are more pro-house building than others, some people are more pro-conservation than others. The one thing I haven't heard people say is the planning system is fine. It doesn't need to change. It doesn't need reform. So there is a consensus that the current planning system, as it is now, is not working, however we define that. And I think the political challenge and the policy challenge facing the UK and England is working out how do we get a reform process that works, and it's particularly working, as Anna has been saying, about for the cities and supporting urban regeneration, both brownfield and greenfield land. So I'm going to be talking about three different things, kind of a diagnosis of some of these issues, which kind of Anna's touched a little bit on. Some short-term wins, so what's kind of currently on the legislative agenda that needs to go through, and also kind of what's the long-term future of planning reform and how do we get to a system that properly works. So I'd just like to ask a question first. Like, who here has read a local plan? Who here has looked at their local plan? Okay, so about half the room or so. Okay, well, I'd encourage people who haven't read their local plan just to kind of at least take kind of a quick skim through it and kind of see what you're dealing with. But the thing that always strikes me, and I think as government has sort of noticed this as well, is that local plans actually don't really have many maps in them. Right? They're not really spatial documents thinking about the economic geography of the place and how development should change. I mean, some people in here might, play games like SimCity or City Skylines here in the past, but the planning system we have doesn't really work like that. It doesn't think about it in terms of, this neighborhood should change in this way, and this kind of change should be allowed in a different way. Instead, what we have is a system which is policy-led. We have, if you read your local plan, you'll see it'll be hundreds of local plan policies, and these are the criteria under which planning decisions at development control is actually managed and delivered. And those local plan policies might be things like affordable housing, they might be things like climate change, they'll include things like the green belt, bicycle parking, green roofs, all this stuff. And you end up with these kind of letters to Santa, right, where you have all of these different policies, that are kind of all bundled together, and there's no trade-offs made between them. A lot of inconsistency between local authorities, and no consistent process by which developers can navigate the system. Now, obviously, there have been reforms, things like the MPPF, that have provided some clarity. Site allocations as well, provide some maps into the system, but it's compared to our international peers, it's a very kind of judicial and wordy process. And this, interpretation, this judicial approach is what makes it a case-by-case system. So on the short term, how do we improve the certainty of the process? How do we get like a better system? Well, if you look at the Levelling Up Bill, what we would say at Centre for Cities is the most important piece of a Levelling Up Bill going forward, are a section of it referring to the National Development Management Policies. So what these are while currently you've got your local plan that has, each of them is sort of written independently and signed off by the inspectorate, the NDMPs would say, all right, under these national policies, so that might be things like climate change, might be things like greenbelt, might be things like demolitions, where everyone can agree there's no spatial variation between different parts of the country on these matters. These should be a single national policy that applies across England, and there's one simple rules-based process for that. And by doing that, it does a number of things. One is that it makes the process more certain for developers, so it's easier to build not just houses, but also commercial and industrial buildings as well. It makes it easier for local authorities, because instead of having to agree 500-page, tomes and door stoppers, it's a simpler and shorter process where they're focusing on what's relevant to the local area rather than these national issues. But it's also good for residents as well, because there's much more certainty in the process. You don't have this back and forth between proposals being rejected on technicalities and then coming around 2 years later. So that kind of more certain process delivered by the NDMPs in the Levelling Up Bill is kind of the most important short-term win in terms of primary legislation, in terms of planning reform. But thinking about that kind of long-term future, beyond the Levelling Up Bill, what are the changes that we really need to our planning system to improve economic growth, create jobs, improve affordability, and improve the dynamism of our cities? Again, coming back to this kind of policy-based approach and the lack of spatial planning within our planning system, some people in the room are probably aware that there's a distinction between local plans and local transport plans. So the local plans decide where the houses go, agreed by district councils, and local transport plans are agreed by county councils and decide where the infrastructure goes. So you have this complete mismatch between infrastructure and houses, when we all know that infrastructure is the big thing that really drives objections to new housing. Now, obviously, they're meant to talk to each other, but we all know they don't really. So thinking about kind of the long term about shifting towards a spatial planning system, and a rules-based planning system where you're integrating that transport planning and integrating that planning for new housing, that ultimately means shifting towards, using the Z word, a zoning system at some point in the distant future. And that's going to be beyond this Parliament. I think it's going to take us a while to sort of work out the politics on doing that. It also depends on local government reform, changing kind of district councils and county councils and that kind of worms. It is challenging, but I was actually struck earlier today, yesterday, attending a CPS fringe on housing, and the chief executive of the CPRE, and I don't want to kind of misquote him or assume that Centre for Cities and CPRE are now like best friends forever. There'll still be lots we can agree to disagree about, but chief executive of CPRE was saying, it would be good if we shifted towards a more spatial planning system that could integrate these and mitigate these concerns. So this comes back to my point that saying nobody really likes the current system. Everyone understands that it is failing, and that's why planning reform is going to happen. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you, Ant. And thank you to all of our panelists. There's certainly some food for thought there. Okay, so at this point, I'd like to open it up to the audience for questions. So maybe take a few at a time. So I see there's a gentleman with his hand up there, one more over there, and one more there. So we'll do 3 at this time, then we'll open it up to more going forward.
Okay, I'm Tony Johnson from Stockport. I was a councillor. I'm very concerned that none of the panel have said that we can improve our housing position by actually trying to improve the utilisation of the existing housing stock. I think that's a very important matter, which should be a major element of policy by the government. So I hope you will take note, Rachel. The importance particularly is in relation to older people, and there are an increasing number of people who live in, like myself, in 4-bedroom houses on their own. And what we need to do is to build more accommodation appropriate for older people, supported tenancies with not rather better than McCarthy and Stone, but because I prefer the public sector housing association model because they can be recycled more quickly. Those with McCarthy and Stone, for example, that you have to continue to pay the council tax and the service charge, and I know people who've been on that trying to sell, having moved into a nursing home for 2 years with tremendous bills. So that's what I'd like to see, and I'd like to see that when we have new permissions given on housing developments, that a proportion of those houses or that accommodation is for older people, with supported tenancies, ideally with health and social care support on site and dining facilities, which would ensure that it was much better and cheaper for local authorities to provide social care, and it should actually ensure that people are less likely to go to hospital, more likely to be discharged promptly from hospital. But I don't see any words of wisdom, on this subject at all. What's the reason for this omission?
So we'll come to that after we've taken a few more questions. But thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Paul Teverson. Actually, quite well timed. I'm from McCarthy Stone, so
Almost planned.
Yeah, almost planned. Just to say that we're very pleased that, I guess, partly to answer that question before, but that the Minister's launched the task force on older people's housing, looking to encourage all forms of specialist housing, both in the social rented sector, also in the affordable home ownership sector. So it was really if the Minister could comment on the progress of that task force, and I think planning is on the agenda, and what does the Minister feel for the potential for planning reform to encourage more bungalows, more retirement communities? I think we build about 7,000 retirement properties a year, but it is about 3 million older people in the country who are looking to downsize, so there could be something done there. Thank you.
Thank you. And then just one more at the back there, please.
Thanks. I'm Zach. I'm a consultant. My question is that the government has enormous powers in existing legislation to liberalise planning policy. It's used them in the past. The reason why we don't need full planning permission for garden extensions because of development orders and statutory instruments. Michael Heseltine's redevelopment of the Docklands was also done with statutory instruments via development corporations. All of this stuff exists. We don't need new legislation to liberalise the planning system. This can be done with a stroke of your pen. So I guess, my question is obviously kind of directed at the Minister, but to everyone else on the panel as well, is that why don't we think these powers are being used that we know exist and governments have used them in the past?
Excellent. Thank you very much. So we have three broad topics there. So one being the utilisation of existing housing stock, retirement housing, and statutory instruments. So I'm conscious a lot of those were directed to you, Minister, but I will try and spread them out across the panel. So to kick things off, Minister, around the utilisation of existing housing stock?
Yes, well, I'm very pleased to be able to answer this question because I know you've asked me at a previous Fringe when we weren't able to address it. And the reason why I didn't mention it specifically is because if I mentioned every single thing I'm working on, I'd need to ask you to stay here for about 3 weeks at least for me to give you a rundown of all the priorities in my portfolio, which, as you will appreciate, is enormous. Nevertheless, the retrofitting of our existing housing stock is vitally important. Of course, we have to do that both for reasons of energy efficiency, both for reasons of tackling damp and mould, both in the private sector and the social rented sector, and also both because there's a huge opportunity of actually adding more units if we're looking at the sort of estate regeneration piece, which can be very successfully done not only in London from some of those council housing areas, but also elsewhere. That is something that the government is already doing and supporting. We have opportunities to go further as well. We do need to sort of look at all the economics of it and work with tenants and residents, and that can be a very, very successful model. That's part of our thinking, so let me assure you that it is. On the Older People's Housing Task Force, thank you again for your question. Really excited about this work. We've brought together academic experts, thinkers, and also developers and people who operate the properties such as yourselves and others. We do recognise the challenges not just of younger people but also of older people. To put this in context, I'm a mum of 4. I have 4 children, all of whom are working professionals. 3 live in London, 2 in the private rented sector, 1's a homeowner. I've got 1 who's a renter in Worcester. So I get this on all sides. I've also got my mother and father, both elderly, both needing very complex care, can't find a property, can't downsize. I've also got 1 grandchild, another one on the way. So I have got the cradle to grave view of this, people. So not only am I speaking on these panels about it, I've got literally my son on the phone going, is this house worth this much rent? And I've got my daughter going, I'm about to have a baby any minute. So it's right on the top of my mind. That's why the Older People's Task Force is so important to address policy levers, what can be done in local authority, planning, etc. And I think there is a lot more we can do actually on the sort of bungalow point. So that's what we'll be looking at. The leasehold problem is a huge problem. I do not know what's in the King's Speech. But if I was a betting woman, I'd be putting money on there being a leasehold bill in that King's Speech to tackle some of the issues, not only in the retirement sector, but elsewhere in the leasehold sector. The gentleman, Zach, who talked about why aren't we using development orders? We are using them. I talked earlier when I sort of made my opening remarks about the work that we're looking at doing in London and Cambridge. We will be utilising the full suite of the powers available across the whole gamut of different types of orders that we need to implement these things. It's not a barrier for us, those powers. It's more about how do we convene everything, what is the funding needed, what are all the other things that need to happen. And I think the permitted development point is something I didn't mention. That's also very important because we can actually get a lot more density, a lot more housing out of permitted development, both in cities and towns and also in the countryside. We're doing 2 very broad consultations on that right now. And we'll be looking at how we can go a lot further on both of those areas.
Excellent. Thank you, Minister. Mark, I'd just like to bring you in on this point as well around sort of the utilisation of existing housing stock and some of your thoughts on some statutory instruments which could be helpful for urban regen.
Yeah, to me, there isn't a kind of a one-size-fits-all answer to these things, and how we incentivise and are creative around maximising the utilisation of existing stock, I think, is one aspect of as kind of a suite of things. I spent 5 years on the board of an organisation called Anchor Hanover, which is the largest provider of housing for older people within the UK. So I saw sort of firsthand the opportunities, but also the challenges that can be addressed or tackled through more specific and targeted policies around how do you deliver care at the same time as catering for an ageing population. I think the point on using the existing powers and existing legislation is, for us, is a no-brainer. I do think there's a huge capacity and capability problem within all of that, and one of the things that we have unquestionably seen over recent years has been partly a layering up of complexity of going through the planning process, and I think that's made a career in planning in many ways a less appealing route forward. But we've also seen through the resourcing of planning authorities just really a hollowing out of that resource. So certainly with targeted resource, and one of our recommendations around brownfield, for example, is to put highly specialist resource that is experienced in dealing with large, complex brownfield urban regeneration projects. Let's have that resource in a more centralised capacity that can be lent and deployed out to help authorities, rather than try to have all of that resource in all authorities. And I think it was very encouraging to see something similar along those lines being talked about by Michael Gove back in July. So I think if we can put the resource in, and we can then use that expertise and capability to focus on how we actually work within what we've got, rather than focus on trying to fix it and spend years getting nowhere, I think those are very sensible suggestions.
Excellent. I'd like to open up to a few more questions. I know the gentleman at the front, one at the back, and at the back as well, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name's Matthew Trimming. I sit on the steering board for Rachel's department that focuses on digital planning. And I just wanted to hear from the panel about their thoughts about how more modern technologies can be applied to the planning system. I think we've heard a little bit about that from Anthony in terms of the spatial approach, and I'm sure you know this, but maybe the rest of the room doesn't. Nottingham is doing some extraordinary stuff in terms of 3D analysis, and that's definitely worth looking at. Everything that Mark has said about brownfield sites, having worked for Tesco's, Sainsbury's many years ago, I totally agree with, and that kind of pooling of resource to put out to major planning opportunities is well worth considering. But really it's just to hear a little bit more about how technology can be applied to what is still a very, very sort of Dickensian analog planning system.
Yep. Thank you. So yeah, just two at the back, please.
Hi, Joel from the Royal Town Planning Institute. I wanted to first congratulate the Minister on being the first of a long line of housing ministers to start to reverse the chronic underfunding of planning departments. That I think is a really simple and should be quick injection of resource and support to help planning activity move forward at pace, which has sadly been lacking for too long. And we really look forward to seeing the planning fees, SIs, come forward and start to take effect with immediately as quick as possible, because local authorities really need that support, and developers are totally willing to pay for this stuff, and this is a good way to go about doing it. So like, when will those SIs start to come forward in the immediate term? And in the long term, this is partly a housing conference with some politics attached, it feels like, with the number of housing fringes going on. But I would want to ask kind of the whole panel, what does the success of reforming our planning laws look like for you? And if I could put forward a kind of vision that I hear quite commonly across the work that professional planners are doing in the public and private sector, it's often to kind of refocus the conversation, not on the technical means by which we change our places, but actually to enable better conversations about a vision of a kind of a better economic and personal future that they'd like to live in, to improve things. So I wonder, is the policy aspects of this conversation getting involved, of getting in the way of the vision stuff that actually is the more important kernel for our kind of political life?
Excellent, thank you.
Minister, when the next election happens, will you view yourself as more successful if house prices have gone up, or if house prices have gone down?
Yeah. Can we also just take one more at the end there, please, as well? Thank you.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
My name is Elizabeth, and my question is, how would you ideally balance the need for lots more houses and lots more public spaces with the need to kind of maintain a semblance of cultural heritage and a semblance of livability in these spaces? Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so 4 quite interesting questions there and a lot for us to get through. So I think maybe we would just start with the digital planning point, and I'd maybe like to come to you first on that.
Yeah, sure thing. So thanks, Matthew. I actually wasn't aware of the Nottingham case, so I'll go away and investigate their model. I mean, I think this is the digital stuff is interesting, right? Because I think it's become a bit of a gateway for people who kind of aren't really close to the weeds of the planning system to kind of see, oh, there are obvious wins here in changing the process and changing how we make decisions to make it more efficient and fairer. That we still do consultations by sticking up little laminated things on lampposts as we wander around, and you're meant to peer at them and say, oh, it's a Class E conversion, an ME permitted development. If we're going to have democracy in the planning system, that is a pretty silly way to do it. But one of the challenges, I think, as you'll know, is that there are so many different policies and so many different rules. It is really hard to digitize and visualize this stuff, especially for people who are, regular citizens who aren't engaged with this day to day. So, standardizing those policies nationally, making it clear that, in a suburban zone, you can build suburban housing, maybe small office buildings, small little retail units. That's kind of broadly what you can expect from that package. In a city centre zone, maybe expect skyscrapers, hotels, bowling alleys, that kind of thing. Simplifying the system in that way, I think, really complements kind of a digitization of the process and improvement for democratic process as well.
Excellent, thank you. And Anna, I'd maybe like to come to you. I'll come to everyone on the panel individually, but Anna, maybe for you to start, what would success look like in the planning process?
I think it would just be that first of all, that the right level, the right economic level has a plan or a strategy that makes sense to the people in that place. And I think that's where this kind of the local democracy matters. And so where we have elected mayors, that seems like the natural level to be thinking about this. And indeed, in Manchester, there is a coordinated structure. I think it's just Stockport that isn't in this. But the other local authorities are part of this plan currently, as I understand it. So success would be that there is that kind of vision, and then investments that are aligned with that are able to happen such that you have better designed cities, and it kind of ties into Elizabeth's point. So better designed cities would balance the need for more houses with maintaining livability, because they would be smart cities, they would have good housing stock, well insulated, green space. It would be planned in a coherent way. So that would be success.
Excellent. And Minister?
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
So can I just sort of preface my remarks by saying I agree with all the comments made by the other panellists and people in the audience about planning reform. And can I also assure you that we're actually doing a lot of this in the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. So not only are we sort of reforming the system to make it quicker, simpler, cheaper, I'm so pleased to hear you mention NMDPs, Anthony, because there's also slightly my favourite part of it, because what that does mean is that we're not actually asking every single local authority to reinvent the wheel and think about what does it mean to meet net zero in my area. We have a template, and then they just need to focus on those genuinely local decisions, and I really do think that is transformational. So we are doing that, but also we do need, as Mark and as I said, we need more resource and capacity in the system. And thank you for your kind words, Joel. We are absolutely doing that. We know we need to do a lot more. And I think the other kind of really key bit I wanted to stress so much is the issue about the benefit that comes out of the planning gain. The land value uplift. So this is such a hugely complex area. But essentially, we know at the moment when planning permission is granted, the land price goes up. And where does that land price go? It goes to the landowner. We need to capture that and allow that to be spent in the community. We currently have different ways that's done. Frankly, they don't work effectively everywhere. So that's why we're looking at this infrastructure levy concept. And I've had a few arguments with people about this, it's fair to say, not only at this fringe but elsewhere. But effectively, it's a tax on the sale of the property when it's sold. And the reason I like that is because no one can argue with the sale price. It's a figure. So, of course, we have to think about how does it get delivered, how does it get delivered at the beginning, all of that. We can do that. Of course we can. We've got lots of people advising us on how to do it. I think, honestly, I just think that is a transformational concept and will really help with a lot of these issues that we're talking about. But I'm going to challenge myself and answer the hardest question that I've been asked, which is the gentleman there in the cap. And I think that you put your finger on the politics of this really well. Because obviously no one, if you're going into a general election, history shows that every single party that goes into election when house prices are falling loses that election. That's a fact. I don't know if anybody else has got any research to challenge that, but that's certainly my understanding of it. However, we also have a situation where we have young people feel that they're not being listened to, and also older people, etc. Lots of people feel that they are priced out of these markets and that the market isn't working for them. So I think we do not have one single housing market. We have multiple different markets all over the country. We may need to see prices going down in some areas. Actually, I'm quite relaxed about that. If prices go down in London, I'd be extremely relaxed about it. If prices go down in somewhere like Cambridge or Oxford, I'd also be relaxed about it. But I'd also be quite relaxed if prices go up in some other areas, such as Teesside, some other areas of the north, where actually the prices have pretty much been static for many years. And that has also slowed down development in those areas because they don't attract the investment that they need to help the government achieve its levelling up agendas. So there are multiple markets in this country. We have to think about all of them. So I hope I've actually answered your question. I've certainly tried to.
Excellent. And just in the interest of time, because we want to get through a few more questions, Mark, I'd maybe like to come to you just on the final point on cultural heritage and your thoughts around that in cities.
Yeah, I think it's a huge opportunity, and we should embrace it accordingly. I think there is and this goes to the heart of a lot of brownfield regeneration. I do think there is probably a skills shortage in many ways. If I look at house building across the UK, in a lot of ways that has been de-skilled as an approach and a view towards standardisation of design and construction, and that means flat green sites are much easier to build on, we can build quickly, we can measure our return on capital and all of those things. And I think it's lost an opportunity of what impact does that have on how people feel about where they're living. What we love doing in cities is being able to take aspects of the heritage and history of a site and actually using that as a core of how we imagine what that site will be in the future. And that won't be about preserving everything and trying to adapt it and repurpose it for what are fundamentally different needs. But there is definitely a task and an opportunity for developers such as ourselves. And the most successful projects in regeneration terms are rooted in the heritage of the place where they're delivered. So I don't think those things are mutually exclusive at all, but it is challenging, and that's my skills point. Just one brief thing on what success looks like for planning. Firstly, I'm running a business. I'm very outcomes focused. We'd be investing twice as much as we are today. And if I just take one very practical example of that and just give you the headlines of a project where we have an outline consent to deliver, and this is in London, 1,800 new residential units, as well as retail leisure as part of a mixed-use scheme, new park, new urban realm, new green space. Now, we started a consultation on that project at the beginning of 2020. After extensive and, in my view, exemplary consultation, we submitted a planning application in January 2022. It was roughly, presumably because of resource issues, just over 6 months before we had any substantive discussion on our application, and that was received a resolution to grant in March 23. 6 months or so on, we as yet don't have a Section 106 sign, which means we can't finalise our design and our procurement, meaning best case it will be mid-24 before we start on site, and 2.5 years after that before we're substantially delivering. Now, that's a 7-year from end-to-end process. That could absolutely be less than 5 years, and that's what drives investment. You know, we put the same amount of capital into the same project in a 5-year period, not a 7-year period, and so that's what success would look like for me.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Have we got any more questions? So one hand went straight up there, right at the very front. We'll take one more there as well. We'll maybe take them both together. Thank you.
Martina Lees from The Times. Are you worried that NDMPs might turn into the next housing target battle? I got emails from CPRE, amongst others, moaning about top-down policies, and it would be used for that. Is this something you worry about?
Thank you. And just one more there as well, please.
Hi, Holly Heavens from Lands Improvements Holdings. A lot of our local authorities are subject to elections in thirds and has a knock-on effect of stymieing local plan progress and planning application progress. For planning reform to be truly successful, would we also need to see political reform that sees elections across the country happening once every 4 years? Thank you.
Great, thank you. I think, Minister, I think the first one's probably the one for you.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Martina, and good to see you. Yes, I know that it's very controversial. It's our job to do difficult things. We are in government. We have to take this on. We have to make the arguments, and you've heard them today, eloquently expounded by people with a great deal more expertise than me. Although I'd just like to make the point that I am not the shortest serving housing minister anymore. Hooray! So I have actually grasped the essence of what is going on here. Much to learn. We have to do this in the national interest. If some people don't like it, if they vote against it in either of the houses, we will continue to make those arguments. And we are right to do it because the planning system is currently a drag on our national growth. So if we cannot fix this, we should not be running this government. But I believe we can fix it. We have the right ideas, we have the will, and actually we do have a majority in the House of Commons. And I think, actually, when you really look at what we have done, it's really important for us. Your point about this being a housing conference with politics attached, let me just divert into politics for one moment, for those of us who are politicians. We actually do not have a terrible record on some of this stuff. We have done some good things. We always need to do more, and there's a lot more to do, and we've heard about it today. But actually, when you look at our targets, we are not there, but our housing delivery, if you look at the record that we have, the 3 highest annual rates of housing delivery in the last 30 years have come in the last 5 years. So we are doing some things right despite everything that is against us. So we need to pick those things out and do more of them and do the reforms where they are needed. And your question about elections in thirds and so on, I mean, I just feel that's such a huge question. We probably need another fringe event on it. But I do take your central point about the politics of it. It's so, we've seen this time and time again, haven't we? And it's actually quite interesting to see the central tension in some of our opposition, our opponents, the Liberal Democrats, should I take them as a random example, going around campaigning against absolutely everything. They're not NIMBYs, they're bananas, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. That's their basic position. And let's face it, that's quite a good electoral strategy to put on their leaflet. Therefore, they get elected in. Then they find that their young Liberals really don't agree with that and just come out with these statements to say just build more bloody houses, which frankly I agree with. So, we're all young Liberals now in that way. But these are political questions that do need to be decided at the ballot box, and we will no doubt continue to have those robust battles.
Excellent, thank you. And maybe I'd like to bring in Dr. Anna and on that final point as well. Dr. Anna?
I mean, I think it's just clear that there's this conflict between the politics on these issues and the economics, and maybe it's actually a job for the politicians to communicate the economics in a way that communities can understand and shift some of the politics. So whether that's with things of national importance, which people can understand this is fundamental for the success of us as a country or the resilience of us as a country, things like net zero infrastructure or the Cambridge cluster, or whether it is local issues like what could be the benefits for the local area.
If I'd just like to take both questions there. First, Martina's point about the NDMPs. I think a difference between the NDMPs and the housing targets is it comes back to this point that no one is satisfied with the current system, and it's so unpredictable, it generates so much political conflict that there is, certainly when you speak to planning organisations, things like TCPA and others, there is a broader consensus that the NDMPs, I think, would be a good step. And I think there is also kind of a sense that a growing recognition that although there's always going to be disagreements about what the rules are and how we apply those rules, there shouldn't really be much debate about whether we have a system where rules should apply at all. And questions about kind of housing targets, what will be the amenity impact of new housing in a particular area, are, I think, quite separate to a discussion about, basically how do you make the system work in a less confrontational and in a smoother way. On the lady there who kind of talking about elections in thirds, I think that's basically true. I think there's kind of a lot of problems within local governments where it is almost like these self-inflicted weaknesses where it really prevents itself from taking on more responsibility from national government and protecting its own powers and really delivering for itself and for the country as a whole. We actually have a report at Centre for Cities coming out in conjunction with the 2030 inquiry on not next Monday but the Monday after, looking at how devolution, economic growth, and with a bit of planning reform as well, are all three legs of a stool, and delivering change at that level, including political change, is actually quite important for delivering both planning reform, housing affordability, and national economic growth.
Excellent, thank you. And maybe we've probably got time for one more round of questioning. So if anyone's got any thoughts, we've got 1, 2, any more for any more? No? Final chance? Yeah. And one more from that chap at the end there as well. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Hannah Shackelford from TPX Impact. I wanted to come back to something, Anna, you mentioned earlier about trying to make plans that are a more sensible geography. And yes, that might work in Manchester because the politics maybe supports that a little bit better. But elsewhere, how do we incentivise places to work together, particularly rural areas, taking on some of that thinking with urban areas where they might feel threatened and might feel like housing is getting pushed upon them?
Excellent, thank you. So one behind, and then we have one more at the end there. Cheers, thank you.
Is your answer the same miles away from elections?
Sorry.
The answer on the house prices going down versus up, which is a sign of success, is your answer the same if we're not in an election year?
Okay,
right. So we've got a few minutes to get an answer for that.
Hi, I'm Kieran O'Brien from Lighthouse, who are a modular housing company based in Sheffield. I just wanted to ask what the panel thought the role of modular could be, and is there room to maybe make the planning system a bit more geared to factory-produced quality housing?
Excellent, thank you. So maybe Dr. Anna, if you want to address that first point.
So this is something we did examine in the report because, for example, in Cambridge, I don't remember the precise numbers now, it's very complicated, but there are some local authorities that are working together and some that are not. And it's fragmented, but the areas that are working together are seeing the benefits of that. I think currently there's a recommendation for local authorities to work together, but it's not really enforced. So I wonder if there are some ways to strengthen the incentives for that, because obviously it is difficult. It's difficult anyway, but particularly when it's kind of different political parties having to work together as well.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah, and yes.
So just kind of on Hannah's point, I mean, that's exactly like the nub of the issue, right? Is this artificial divide we've created within local economies between urban districts and these kind of more rural hinterlands, when obviously urban areas depend on the hinterlands for workers and hinterlands depend on urban areas for employment and for growth. I mean, I think when I was kind of alluding to like we need kind of these big political changes and reforms to the local government, these are exactly the kind of changes we need to be looking at, kind of overcoming this artificial divide between town and country. We're looking to do a bit more work. We'll kind of hint at it, I think, in this report we've got coming out the Monday after next. We're looking to do more work on that next year. But, I think for a hint of it, people might recall kind of the Redcliffe Maud reforms or Redcliffe Maud report back in 1969, which proposed unitary councils across England matching economic geography. I think a lot of that report is still very relevant 70, 50 years later. And, that's really where the direction which we need to get to if we want to, solve those issues you're describing.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm very, very conscious of time, so I've just addressed those final two questions quickly. Mark, I just wanted to check if you had any thoughts on the modular question, modular homes.
I do. And somewhat fortuitously, in 2001, I had the pleasure of running a business that opened what went on to become Europe's largest modular manufacturing facility at the Unite Group. In 2011, I had the opposite, whatever opposite of pleasure is, of closing it. And there are two things that I would flag that really got in the way of making modular construction at scale successful. One of them is unquestionably planning, partly because of the manufacturing works when you've got steady throughput of product, and if you see delays or changes, then that has a bearing on the economics of it. There's then the planners don't like, understandably, grids of windows and simple things that are easy to manufacture. The second thing, which I think is probably a bit more deeply rooted, is how the supply chain and the sector is set up within the UK. So I certainly think planning, recognising the opportunity, would be a help, but I don't think it's the sole answer.
Excellent, thank you. And to that chap's question, just one word, yes or no answer to that one, maybe?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you. And I think that's all we've got time for today. And I think just a few quick thank yous from me. Just like to first off say thank you to all of our panelists. I think it's been a really, really interesting discussion. Thank you all very much for that. I'd like to thank Landsec for sponsoring today's session as well. And finally, for you all for coming along today as well. And a final plug. We have a lot of Onward bottles and cups at the back. Advertised here at the front. Please do take them. They are sustainable, and we've got loads of them we need to get rid. So thank you.
Ah, lovely. Thank you.